So now we're turning to our second session of the morning, and I'm really honored to introduce the second annual Thomas E. Lovejoy and Edward O. Wilson panel, this year titled The Promise of Ecosystem Restoration. Tom Lovejoy and E.O. Wilson were both trustees at NYBG and real giants of the environmental movement, and we're proud to celebrate their legacies through this annual series. I'm equally honored and delighted to introduce the panel's moderator, NYBG's Chief Science Officer, Dr. Mauricio Diaz-Granados. Dr. Diaz-Granados joined the garden in June after a distinguished career at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, where he served as a research leader responsible for Kew's Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, which worked to address environmental and societal challenges. While at Kew, Dr. Diaz-Granados led the development and publication of the Catalog of Useful Plants of Colombia and the Catalog of Fungi of Colombia, which have quickly become highly impactful and referenced works on one of the world's most biodiverse countries. Previously, Dr. Diaz-Granados was Director for Science at the Bogota Botanical Garden, where he led the funding effort for the construction of the largest greenhouse in South America. With more than 20 years of teaching experience, including lecturing on botany and biology at several universities, Dr. Diaz-Granados has produced a large body of notable scholarship and is frequently invited to share his insights at presentations and talks as a guest speaker. Please join me in welcoming Mauricio Diaz-Granados, who will introduce the panelists.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that introduction. And thank you all to be here. It is my pleasure to be moderating this panel today. And I would like to start with a brief introduction and follow up to, from the inspiring talk by Laura. So we live in the age of extinction, sadly. Biodiversity is declining at an alarming rate. 2 in 5 species of plants are estimated to be threatened with extinction, and 1 of every 3 species of trees are threatened as well. We estimate that we know about 10% of global biodiversity, and of that 10%, we have strong taxonomic, functional, and ecological data. The remaining percentage is unknown. So basically, we are losing the species as we speak without knowing their properties, their uses, the potential services that they can provide to humanity. 73% of the global land has been transformed, and the deforestation rate is critical. Every year, between 10 and 20 million hectares are destroyed, which is equal to 1 soccer field every 2 seconds. For all of you that know the family thane forest here at the garden, that deforestation rate is equal to destroying that forest in just 56 seconds. Invasive species are another environmental challenge. Of those over 40,000 species that Laura was mentioning that are under threat, 42% of those are threatened by the invasive species. And the big question that remains is, can we repair some of the damage humans have done to ecosystems and biodiversity? Ecological restoration seeks to do just that, and restoration ecology is the science that underpins it. And mentioning, Jennifer was mentioning Edward Osborne Wilson, one of the most famous biologists, and also an inspiring tutor for many of us. He wrote in 1992, "Here is the means to end the great extinction spam. The next century will, I believe, be the era of restoration in ecology. So let's make it the decade of ecological restoration." And today we have a distinguished panelist here that I I suppose they know how to achieve that. They work at different scales, not just spatial scales, but also temporal scales, in different ecosystems, from forest to prairies to urban environments, and with different approaches. So I would like to first start with asking the panelists to introduce yourself and to tell us about what are you doing now and what's your experience in this field of science and art, as Laura was telling us as well. And I would like to start with Sarah, perhaps.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
There.
Can you hear me now? Yes. All right. Oh, nice feedback. Well, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here on this panel, and I'm going to introduce myself with a little tie to the place where we are together today. The New York Botanical Gardens really plays a larger-than-life part in the story of how I came to this work, and I want to pick up on the themes of marrying together social justice and biodiversity. I grew up in the South Bronx, and my parents were tenant organizers. And at that time, we lived in a neighborhood that had no natural space, and the public parks were not a place that we could safely spend time. And so on a regular basis, my mom, who was a real go-getter activist type, would load up our car before seatbelts were a mandatory thing with as many kids from our neighborhood as she could fit, and we would drive here to the garden because she had a really strong sense that it was not okay to spend your childhood without a connection to the natural world, and that you couldn't go through the seasons of childhood without being able to see the seasons of nature changing. And then when I was in elementary school, we moved to Mosholu Parkway. So I spent the bulk of my childhood and adolescence and early adulthood living just 3 blocks from the garden. And during that time, this continued to be a place where I spent a lot of time, but had no idea that the nature that existed here within the garden was just a tiny sliver of the nature that exists within the 5 boroughs of New York City. It took going to college upstate and graduate school and a decade of working and living out of New York City to come back and realize that New York actually has 20,000 acres of natural habitats, and that those natural habitats, which are over 10% of our city's land area, represent this incredible source of both ecology and biodiversity, but also an incredible place and resource for the people of New York City. So I've spent the last decade as the executive director of an organization called the Natural Areas Conservancy, and we work to elevate the care of natural areas within New York City and now across the nation through a national Forests in Cities network. And I look forward to sharing more about that work in the context of this panel.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Let's continue with Daniel, please. Dr. Daniel.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Daniel Kinka, Danny. I'm the Wildlife Restoration Manager for American Prairie. I flew in from Montana for this. If you remember Laura's map of protected areas, you might have noticed that there's this big white stripe kind of conspicuously running from Saskatchewan down to Mexico. That's the Great Plains, which we have globally, but including in North America, kind of neglected for many reasons to protect in one meaningful way or another. And American Prairie's goal is to reverse that tide a bit by setting aside about 3.2 million acres of land. Eventually, we're working on building out that land base. That's 5,000 square miles. It's about the size of Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks combined, or about the size of the state of Connecticut. So a massive amount of land to kind of restore a fully functioning prairie ecosystem and then manage it as a public access project in perpetuity. I've worked for the organization for about 6 years. My job focuses more, right out of the way, I'm more of a wildlife person, so thank you for accommodating my naivete when it comes to botany. I will do my best here, but I did come at this more through like the wildlife side of things. The bison stuff was mostly familiar to me. But yes, I'm very happy to be here and talk about how we do ecological restoration out in that part of the world, and also discuss how that is similar and different to the work of my colleagues here on the panel.
Thank you, Daniel. And let's go with Todd, please.
Thanks, Mauricio. Hello, everybody. Just want to give Laura's presentation was so incredible, so thank you so much for that. Very, very, very inspiring to me because of my role as Arthur Ross Vice President for Horticulture and Living Collections here at the Garden. I live every day at the nexus of social justice, art, and science. And I do that because within horticulture are several programs, Bronx Green Up and our compost project. Bronx Green Up is a program that works with Bronx residents to transform vacant lots and other underused spaces into vibrant community gardens and urban farms, places where people can work directly with nature. This is Bronx Green Up's 35th anniversary this year, so a shout out to that amazing crew. I oversee the horticulture program here, so that's the care and feeding of our plant collections. We've got 15,000 different types of plants outdoors and under glass, assembled in the very traditional taxonomic way from the late 19th century up to modern contemporary display gardens that are meant to kind of capture the beauty of plants and engage public in the beauty of plants and diversity. And then lastly, we oversee the ongoing ecological restoration of the 50-acre Thane family forest, which is the reason why the garden was established on this site in the late 19th century. It was considered in the late 19th century to be the most important natural area anywhere within or near New York City. And the garden has been literally built around that amazing remnant of wild nature. Over the past 130 odd years, we've had sort of a complex and changing relationship to that forest. Over the past 20 years, we've been focused again on restoring it to health to the best of our abilities, and I'm sure I'll have the opportunity to talk more about that going forward. So thank you, Mauricio.
And Eric, please.
Yes. Hi, everybody. It's such an honor to be with you all today and with all of you and to hear Laura's talk. I'm an ecosystem and landscape ecologist. For most of the last 25 years, I worked across the street at the Wildlife Conservation Society doing wildlife conservation issues, mapping human influence globally, so this gradient of human influence that Laura was talking about. My conservation work was really focused on the wildest places of the world and the wildlife that lived in those places. And in the midst of that work, as a kind of newcomer to New York, I became very interested in the historical ecology of this place, what this place was like. And I ended up writing a book about what Manhattan was like a few hours before Henry Hudson sailed into New York Harbor 400 years ago, and how it became that place. And that experience is sort of completely reverse the way I think about conservation in our conservation work. I used to think that the very most important thing I could do was to help save the wildest places that I grew up loving so much. And now I actually think the most important thing we can do is get cities to work to conserve nature. And at the same time, that's the nature of the cities. The nature of cities is what's going to allow our cities to survive into the future, particularly with climate change. And it was talking to people here at the New York Botanical Garden that I made a move a couple months before Mauricio came. And I'm the new Vice President of Urban Conservation. And the idea is to build on the kind of horticultural expertise that we have, the scientific expertise, our amazing education programs, and build a program in urban conservation for New York City and for cities around the world that helps us see the long-term trajectory. Where we were in the past, all the changes that have come, and then the choices that we're making and the values that we're bringing to give to the future of the city over the next hundreds and even thousands of years. And I really believe, as Mauricio was pointing out, that we live in this really critical times where the decisions that we make in our generation are going to have ramifications for literally for millennia going forward. And so it's really important for us to do this work now, and it's going to require us to make big changes in the way we think and the way we act, and the way we live on a daily basis. And that's the kind of work that we want to do here at the New York Botanical Garden.
Thank you, Eric. So back in the 90s and early 2000s, I did my first works on ecological restoration. I was a biologist in Colombia, and together with my dear friend and colleague Wilson Ramirez, who is now the head of the National Program for Ecological Restoration in Colombia, we started restoring several areas. What we were doing was assessing the areas, interpreting the previous states, And with the help of students, we would be planting trees and rehabilitating substrates and monitoring progress. It was very, very challenging, many times not achieving the results that we were expecting. Then in 2014, I served as Director of Science at the Bogota Botanical Garden, as Jennifer was mentioning, and I was leading a very strong program on ecological restoration for the city. During my administration, we planted about 300,000 trees, and we restored 14 wetlands, and we used a different approach. As Laura was mentioning, you can try to recover the status of the previous vegetation based on historical data, or you can do a sympathetic interpretation about how the future looks like. And that's what we were doing in Bogota, planting the trees of the future. Because if you can imagine, a city has many times, like, I don't know in New York, but maybe even millions of trees and lots of natural areas. So maybe it's better to anticipate what the future state will look like. But sometimes it was like we were feeling like we were kind of playing with nature because we just don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if that's going to end up in positive results. And we can utilize all the scientific knowledge, and sometimes we get unknown results. So my first question is going to be for Sarah, because you're kind of facing a similar situation managing 20,000 acres in these natural areas in New York. And I would like to know, how do you do it?
Thank you. Well, it's primarily the purview of large public agencies. So the majority of the natural areas within New York City are under the jurisdiction of the New York City Parks Department and the National Park Service. But I will, you described and others have described kind of getting a sense of what the existing ecology, and I'll say also social ecology, of the places that we're trying to manage are, and making the best decisions at that intersection of art and science. So I wanted to actually share, by way of answering your question, that in 2013 and 2014, our organization partnered with the Parks Department and many of the institutions in this room to conduct a comprehensive social and ecological assessment of the natural areas in New York City. And we deployed 25 research scientists over 2 years to collect information about the health of our large forests, our wetlands, grasslands, and we also spoke with over 4,000 New Yorkers. And I'll share just 2 findings, and then I'll kind of talk about how we've deployed that information in management. The first is 50% of New Yorkers reported that they experienced wild nature only on city parkland. And for us, that really transformed this idea about the purpose of public land within the city and the idea of urban parks as active recreation spaces, where state parks or maybe national parks are the kind of the place where people will retreat to experience more wild nature. And it really speaks to the need to make these places accessible for the kinds of meditation, solace, quiet, ability to really commune with the natural world that we look for in other places. And the second is that across over 7,000 acres of forests, 85% of our canopy is dominated by native trees, and the average age of trees in our canopy is close to 100 years old. So we have these really intact canopies across our city, but only 50% of our understory is native dominated, and we're not seeing the strength of the sort of ecological systems functioning on their own the way we would like to see. So the short answer, that was a long lead up, but the short answer to your question is we're trying to really invest in the foundational knowledge that allows us to make ecologically informed decisions about how to more strategically target things like underplanting as opposed to afforestation, thinking about public access and trails in conjunction with restoration of ecosystems as a way to actually close desire lines and create more contiguous space that isn't trampled by people, thinking about ways to really increase the both ecological and social values that these places have to offer.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. And you were mentioning afforestation. So that's planting trees in an area that did not have tree cover. And probably you hear all the time now that we need to plant trees, we need to plant trees, we need to plant trees. But perhaps that's not the solution in all ecosystems. And we have here Daniel, who's been leading the program of ecological restoration in prairies. So I would like to know how does the ecological restoration happen in prairies if it's not about through planting trees?
We don't plant a lot of trees. So the kind of the idea that we operate on out at American Prairie is this idea that the habitat remains surprisingly maybe intact, right? I mean, from the grasslands perspective, yes, some of that has been tilled up for wheat farms or assorted other things that maybe in a wettish year you could grow in a dry prairie. But for the most part, it has since settlement been used as pasture land. It's where we make beef. It's where people raise cattle because you can't really grow anything out there. And that has been kind of the salvation of the prairie in many ways, because we think from the kind of the foundational level of the ecosystem up, there are exceptions to this. I'm glossing over details, but that remains largely intact. What is different is that it has been significantly kind of de-wilded. Anything that's larger than like a house cat has probably been either eradicated or driven into very, very low abundance. And I'm really happy that Laura mentioned this too, right? When we talk about the biodiversity loss crisis, we need to address extinction as this very scary thing, but there's also this idea that we've just turned down the volume on wildlife, kind of globally, right? There's this statistic that I think currently, and Laura said this a different way, but 3% of the biomass on the planet of mammals is made up by all wild things. So said another way, 97% by weight, if you put all the living mammals on a scale, 97% of that is humans and their livestock. So people and cows, basically. And the other 3% is every giraffe and bison and blue whale left on the planet. I think that's kind of like staggering, right? That doesn't necessarily, like extinction is a part of that, but it's something separate. Like we've just suppressed the amount of stuff when it comes to wildness in the environment so much. And so your question is about, kind of how does American Prairie go about doing this? And the operating thesis is kind of like, well, we don't know exactly what climate change is going to predict for the temperate grasslands, for American Prairie. We're not trying to go back in time and create like a pre-colonial vision of an American Prairie, but we do think as kind of a first principle, the best case for restoring resilience and allowing that ecosystem to fully function is, at least first, we should fill it back up, right? Put that wildlife abundance back into the place so that these ecological systems and ecosystem services can kind of start to spin and start to function again. So, I mean, we do use the term rewilding, and I think of it as just that. Now, we're not a wildlife agency, so I don't have the authority to, excepting bison, that's another story. They're actually considered livestock in our part of Montana. But say beaver, right? I don't have the authority to just go pick up beaver where there are beaver in western Montana, put them in the back of my truck, drive them out to eastern Montana. Sometimes I wish I could. Is this being recorded? But that's not available to us. So oftentimes we are doing habitat improvement, but it's kind of like the Field of Dreams model, right? Like if you build it, they will come. How can we make that habitat as robust as possible for supporting this wildlife, which in many cases is either there, just in low abundance, or very, very nearby, and so has the ability to kind of recolonize itself as long as there's tolerance, top-down tolerance from people to allow it to do so, and the habitat is intact enough to kind of make them want to come back in the first place. So that's kind of our vision of rewilding and our model for at least putting that ecosystem back together enough that we can then kind of seriously think about how to address future problems like climate change.
Thank you. So rewilding, and Todd, you have decades of experience managing NYBG's native forest, the family theme forest. And I would like to know what you have learned during these years and what's been your also approach about restoring and maintaining these forests?
What's my time limit? I mean, really, an extraordinary amount. And really, to answer that question, let me provide a little bit of context. As I said earlier, the site was chosen for the home of the New York Botanical Garden in the 1890s because of what is now called the Thane Family Forest, but was then called the Hemlock Grove. The garden was founded by botanists Nathaniel Britton and Elizabeth Britton. Another shout out to Laura. Elizabeth Britton needs to get way more props than she's gotten. Just to have her work daylighted is the most amazing thing. But anyway, botanists are great catalogers. So one of the first things they did when they took over the site was they cataloged the spontaneous flora of the site in the late 1890s. And so we have this amazing baseline information about what was growing here naturally, really when the garden was established. At the time, the cutting edge of ecological science was that nature knows best, and the best thing that we can do with any natural ecosystem is to step away, is to put a fence around it and leave it alone. And literally, Nathaniel Britton specified a policy of let alone in terms of forest management. Fast forward a few years, and it turns out that many of the wildflowers that were cataloged in the late 1890s were disappearing from the forest very quickly. And I think that has a lot to do with Elizabeth Britton's passion for preserving wildflowers. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. Fast forward a few more years, and the hemlocks that defined the space were declining. There were lots of old hemlocks, very few young hemlocks. And so they could fast forward in their minds to see a forest that was very different in 50 years or 100 years than it was when the garden was founded. So that policy of let alone slowly drifted into a policy of active management, but never particularly vigorous or well-resourced. So we have those baseline data, and since for the past 20 years or so, we've been pursuing a program of active restoration in the forest. And that really has been exactly the combination of art and science that Laura described. There was no roadmap for how you restore an old growth urban forest. We did have data. We knew what was missing. So in 1899, 82% of the spontaneous flora here was native. In 2015, that's about 62% of the spontaneous flora is native. So there's been incredible change across the system. So we've learned that all of these negative human impacts that we've all been hearing about, we all know about, have had a profound impact on biodiversity here. But we've also learned that they haven't had a profound impact on ecosystem function. As Sarah mentioned, a large percentage of the trees in our forest in New York City are native. There's this amazing persistence of some of these living things. And so what we've been trying to do over the past 2 decades is to tap into the natural processes that created the forest to begin with, and to allow the forest to guide our work. So instead of trying to reestablish some arbitrary moment in time, say a hemlock grove, and then fight like gardeners to keep those hemlocks alive, we've been doing a little work, measuring the impacts of that work, and then adjusting our work based on those impacts, adaptive management. So we've learned that if you give nature some space and some support, it's remarkably resilient. It has the remarkable capacity to regenerate. If you proceed cautiously and thoughtfully, you won't get so far ahead of yourself that you make terrible mistakes. We make lots of small mistakes, but those mistakes, we think, are kind of manageable. And maybe the last thing I'll say that we've learned is that nature in cities has all of the mystery, all of the wildness, all of the beauty, all of the inspiring qualities of nature anywhere on the planet. And it's been so gratifying to see our visitors, volunteers who come in and help us remove invasive species, just people walking through the forest on a beautiful November day, get all of the satisfaction of that interaction with nature that poets and composers have tried to put into words and music.
Thank you very much. So nurturing, renaturing or greening is not the same as ecological restoration. And often people just plant trees in the cities because they are beautiful, so ornamental trees. And sometimes they don't consider the ecosystem benefits of those trees or the potential to create ecological corridors or buffer areas or to maintain the natural processes. Eric, you're proposing for the garden an engaging strategy to transform the city that you call Nature Your City, NYC, by the way. And I would like to see if you see any intersection between your proposal and the common practices of ecological restoration, and if you can describe a little bit more your proposal.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. And I come to this work both as an ecologist and as kind of a historian. And so, when I see us discussing each individual project, I think it's always helpful to step just one step back and think about, well, why is that project even possible? So why is the Thane Family Forest here? It's because the New York Botanical Garden is here. But why is the New York Botanical Garden here? It's because there was a set of values about institutionalizing science and nature and the environment in the 1890s. And why was that? It's because the city was growing so fast, in the 19th century. In the 19th century, Manhattan's population went from 40,000 people to 2.2 million people. And so you have, these people at the end of their lives writing books about where they used to, hunt and fish in Lower Manhattan, and then all that, is gone. And they just want to remind people that was the case. And that, of course, is in the context of colonization and settlement and, all the things that happened. So, there are these series of values that we bring to the landscape. And, as we mentioned at the beginning, we're at this really critical time. And I think, New Yorkers and actually I think even people for most of history have only been thinking about their own needs, their own capacities. What do I need to do to get to the end of the day to solve my problems right now? And I just don't have the capacity to think about the future. And I think finally we've gotten to our point in society where there are these little glimmers, these little places where we can think about the future and what are the options we're giving. So, in Laura's talk, she said, what values most is the sort of ethical framework to that. And so what we're trying to do in the Nature Your City initiative is, one, to help people see this landscape as an ecological landscape. New York City isn't just about the human beings in the city, it's also about the plants and animals of the city that predate humanity in this city, and it will continue long beyond the time that we are here. So that's the first thing, to see us as part of an ecological landscape, a continuum that is both specific to our site, but also true of the patterns of the Earth over centuries and millennium and eons. And then second, to open up the values that we bring through a program in ecological democracy. So, one of the things we've learned is that restoration can't just be, one group of people making the decision and then other people just receive those. The way to make it strong and robust into the future is to allow everybody to present their vision and then have a process for bringing those together. And technology, using the internet, the power of the internet, and using the power of scientific models, we have this platform called Vision Maker that allows you to look at your neighborhood, to see its historical ecology, to see its contemporary ecology, and then to suggest what the future ecology could be. And through that, we can help, work with our colleagues at the Natural Areas Conservancy, with city agencies, with government agencies, and with all of you, your gardens, the street outside your apartment house, the bioswale there, your relationship to your nearest park, to help form a solution for New York City that gives to the future and doesn't take away from the future. Because I really think that's the thing that we all can share, is a world that allows each of us individually and each individual plant and animal to live its fullest life, to thrive in interaction with each other, and to evolve over time, so that we can all continue over the long distant future of the city, our country, our planet.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one sad side of being a botanist is that sometimes you recognize when you see an ecosystem that is not healthy. And in my case, for instance, again, as Colombian, when I'm traveling by land in the Bogota region or the nearby areas, and usually people stop and say, "Oh, what a beautiful landscape." And my heart is heartbroken because I just see eucalyptus and from Australia and acacias from Australia and conifers from Mexico and pennisetum grasses from Africa, and the landscape entirely transformed. And only when I see something like we call jungle, people is like jungle, my soul like kind of gets re-energized. And so from the scientific point of view, when we look at ecosystems, we can classify the things, the topics that we study into 4 features. So we look at composition, so what species we find in each ecosystem, structure, how those different elements interact in space, functionality, what are the workflows and the interactions among species, and the services, for instance, that those ecosystems provide to other species or to us, and temporality, how those arrangements change over time, how new species arrive, how new species leave, and that is constantly changing, constantly changing. But of course, we have lots of elements, potential causes of disturbance. And disturbance is what makes habitat degradation many times. So we have from fires of anthropic origin to deforestation, to pollution, to overharvesting, etc. So in the speakers, we have a very large range of ecosystems and environments in which you work, from prairies to urban forests to natural areas or to the city. I would like to know what are your drivers of change, the drivers of change that you have identified in your different environments, and how you can monitor the state of health, if you can think about, or resilience. And who wants to start with this question? I saw Todd, yes.
Avarice and hubris, do they count? Really, when you get to, the great benefit that I have, I so admire the other panelists who have, a broad remit, who have such global perspective. I know one place really, really well. And when you get to know one place really, really well, you start to see things really start to kind of pop out. And so the entire suite of anthropogenic disturbances is impacting the health of the Thane family forest. And so it's hard to pick the one that drives things the most. I would say historically, fragmentation, just separating the forest from the rest of its environment. I would say of things that you can see, invasive species, both plant species, but also pests and diseases. Of things you can't see, but are probably profoundly impactful, soil pollution, air pollution. We have very high concentrations of heavy metals in the soil. There was a paper done in the 80s that showed that the forest soils are hydrophobic due to the long-term deposition of hydrocarbons from people driving cars and operating furnaces. And so it's the interaction of all of those disturbances that creates the nature that we have now. But as I said before, then you look and you see this natural energy that is allowing the individual plants and the populations of plants and other things, I don't really pay attention to other things so much. They all move a little bit too fast, but plants thankfully stay kind of where they are. There's the capacity to adapt, the capacity to thrive in spite of what is just the most horrible list of things if you spend time to think about it. And so ultimately it's that process that I think is driving change, and it's very inspiring to me that at least in this very small scale, that process tells me that if we just get in and start doing a little bit of thoughtful work, we can untether that process, that natural process within the context of cities. And I think that's what we're all here to think about how we do.
Well, I might say, I think the two biggest things, well, the three biggest things that are shaping nature, both here and globally, are climate change, obviously, urbanization, so the movement of people, into cities, into denser ways of living, and third, the economic enterprise, the way the economic enterprise is managed and how big it's gotten. And that has grown so enormously even over the course of our lifetimes. And all three of these things are in such flux right now that we have all become accustomed to that they change all the time. But in the past, these things were actually all very slow and stable. If you look at the graphs, they all kind of have this shape that's like this, and then they go like that, and then there's a big debate about what the future is going to be, right? And it's the tensions around that debate that are shaping our lives, but also shaping nature and creating so much like anxiety and unrest. But it's also such a dynamic time that's why the decisions we make today are so important for the values we give to the future.
I'll just piggyback on that and say, I think one thing that you've both touched on, but that I think about a lot and want to just highlight a little bit more, is that those factors of climate change and urbanization and economic drivers are at their peak in the urban environment. The urban context is a place where all those things are happening, but at a greater intensity and kind of ahead of the curve of what's happening everywhere else. So we know Forest Service, I think they said 98% of their land holdings were considered rural 100 years ago. Only 50% of those are considered rural today due to fragmentation and urbanization. And the kind of research and the kind of adaptive management that we can pilot in cities, especially if we take good notes and we really document what we learn, we're not just thinking about and providing places for people and supporting local biodiversity. We are trailblazing the kind of innovative management and the marrying together of kind of the best of historical ecological approaches and the best of novel approaches to provide our local residents with access to the best version of nature that we can muster. But we're also really at a small scale thinking about massive species change. Things like heat, which is happening everywhere, happens way more intensely in the urban context. What is that doing to our local ecology? We might learn something that can change how we think about the ecological implications for heat across our globe. So I think for me, that feels like a hopeful part of the work that we do, that chance to innovate at a scale and maybe a little bit kind of untethered from a rigidity of scientific approach that is maybe harder to do in other landscape scales. I think in the urban there's a little bit of a kind of appreciation for a maverick spirit, and I think that is really helpful in many ways.
Can I just say one quick thing about that, which is, of course, cities have been centers of innovation. That's actually why cities exist in the first place, is because of their capacity for innovation. But if you were to pick one city to work in, what city might that be? Yeah, New York. And why New York? No, I'm seriously, why New York? It's because it's the first megacity on the face of the planet in 1950, because it has these amazing institutions, all this scientific expertise, but also artistic and media and financial expertise. So that an example here, like, the Central Park or the High Line or the Natural Areas Conservancy, that idea will spread to landscape, to city, in a way that's faster than possible. Yeah. So, I think our work here, When you go walk in the Thane Family Forest, you'll have a lovely experience of the Thane Family Forest and think about all the things that Todd is trying to do to keep that forest there for you. But then think about what that forest means in the next larger landscape. What does it mean in the Bronx? Right? How important it is to the Bronx, to speak to what Sarah was saying, and then how important is it in the New York City context, and therefore how is it in the global context such an important treasure and something to learn about and preserve and to restore into the future.
Tanya?
To the idea of what, almost like an indicator type of thing that we might track that we're concerned about. I don't want to. At American Prairie, the thing that I worry about is kind of like stasis or being stuck in place. Like, I think a big part of with the restoration work that we do is kind of like adding dynamism back to the system, if that makes sense. You have to give it room. We have to fill it back up with wildlife, like I already mentioned, but you have to kind of allow it room to breathe. We have these ideas about how bison are ecosystem engineers because they kind of manage a shifting mosaic of prairie grasslands, right? They actually do that in combination with fire and another ecosystem engineer, the black-tailed prairie dog, right? But I think if the history of the prairie is kind of the shift from like indigenous biodiversity to like domesticated homogeneity. Things are just very static out there, right? There's fences everywhere which prevent the migrations that add resilience but also allow wildlife to do what they do and provide those ecosystem services. With traditional cattle ranching, things are changing now, thankfully. But the traditional model of take half, leave half was just like the cows take half and you leave the rest of the grass for the rest of the wildlife, right? Well, if you're a bird species that prefers like a kind of a half-grazed habitat, you're doing relatively okay. And by relatively okay, I mean your numbers are still declining. They're just declining less than your compatriots as birds. But if you're a bird species that wants this kind of what we would traditionally consider overgrazed or a prairie dog town, a burned area, right? You've got nothing left in a traditional system and you are tanking very, very fast. The other end of that spectrum is the ungrazed grass. It's been a decade since it burned or was grazed for whatever reason. There is a whole birds are the classic example, but this ripples throughout the ecosystem. You require that different kind of habitat, right? Those are the same grass species. That's the same composition of species, generally speaking. It's structural diversity that's different, right? And that structural diversity is also not static, but shifts around. That's this idea of a shifting mosaic. So whether it's removing or modifying fences or restoring that ecological role of bison or prairie dogs or fire, all of that is just kind of like allowing the system to move or to breathe, to like fully inhabit its kind of movement space, its dynamism in ecosystems. I know that's all very kind of nebulous and more than a little bit hand-wavy, but I think that's, if I had to pick a metric, I think that's the thing that we're really concerned about. I'm actually curious to hear in your guys' experience how you think about that in these, I have the privilege of working on this massive landscape, right? And I think it's kind of a luxury to be able to think about, like, well, how do you turn the engine back on? But how do you do that in these smaller settings, right? Or can you, can you allow for that full range of dynamism? I'm taking your job, Mauricio.
Todd,
I'm sorry. No, we'll move on.
jump for it. Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah,
please.
well, I think so thank you very much. It's a great question, and I know that the fellow panelists will be able to build on what I say. We are connected to all of the landscape around us, which is largely urban buildings, roads, trains. But here at NYBG, we have this really remarkable thing, which is called the Bronx River, which flows about 24 miles from Westchester County into the East River, which is a north-south corridor in the middle of this very dense urban and suburban environment. And so we really can't think about what we're doing here in our forest without thinking about what's happening upstream and downstream within the riparian zone. And then as we're starting to think about it more, we really can't think about making great progress in terms of ecological restoration in our forest if we're not looking at the whole watershed. So we're starting in kind of urban, I think, ecological restoration, urban kind of nature science, to look at the ways that we are connected with the larger environment, and then to look at that larger environment as not just an interesting kind of component of larger nature, but an essential way that all of nature can respond to the changes from climate change. As I said, the Bronx River is a north-south corridor. As things migrate from south to north due to climate change, New York City represents a block, a barrier. So creating corridors, literal and figurative corridors through cities with the city as part of that corridor, I think has to be a really important component of kind of landscape scale, regional scale, biodiversity conservation, and conservation more broadly. But I'm sure Sarah also has a thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about grasslands and prairies, and I think I mentioned to you in our pre-call that we have over 4,000 acres of what are technically either grasslands or maritime forests within New York City, and it is really, really hard to manage the kind of natural landscape that requires some sort of cyclical shock or reset in order to continue to exist. It's really hard to think about something that's fire dependent, for example, or think about, in the absence of, fire, like a mowing regime that would keep you kind of in a dynamic state and keep you from just sort of, moving through succession into being a forest. Some of that has to do with just political and funding barriers, and it's really hard. Maintenance is really, really hard in folks, kind of know it's easier to build something new than to maintain what you've got. And a lot has to do with just, there are aspects of kind of natural systems that are much harder to handle in the urban environment. And I would say one example, we've seen a tenfold increase in the deer population in Staten Island, which has the largest contiguous natural areas over the last 2 decades. And there's a forced sterilization program and a lot of controversy about whether at some point culling could be an option. But we're talking about, deer populations that are right up against suburban and highly urban residential neighborhoods with families and kids, and same challenges, but in a just much more kind of compressed time and space.
Yeah, all that's very true. I think the other thing I would say is, the way land tenure works in the urban environment is so much more fine scale than it is, other places. So Todd, works here at the New York Botanical Garden, but that's in the, in Jennifer's jurisdiction, right? And Sarah works with, the park system, the city park system. But if you actually try to, the landscape doesn't work that way, right? And now, we've broken into little tiny lots, and, in the American system, people have a lot to say over their tiny lots, really. It's just, the zoning code and the laws, and then social norms. And yet, I was giving a talk for an NYU class last week up on the edge, at Hudson Yards, and looking across, Manhattan, and which is an amazing sight. But one of the things I was noticing is all the green roofs that are forming, right? Some smaller, it's not very far from the Javits Conference Center, which has a big one. But there are all these little ones that people are doing for their own reasons. And so, if we can create a norm where people are thinking, oh, well, those are actually creating landscapes, across them, not because they're required to or because, the zoning code says they have to, but because they want to. And if they knew what to do, if they knew what to plant, what to restore, even a little pot on the top of their building, that could add up to, whole-scale ecosystem restoration, at least some of the functions that we once upon a time, even in Manhattan.
Yeah. So Laura mentioned in several slides Aldo Leopold, one of the pioneers of ecological restoration, and also considered one of the fathers of bioethics. I did a master in bioethics. And the reason why I did it was because I found that through science and biology, you could really make profound changes in nature, and that I needed to have some tools to make responsible decisions. Through science, you can, as Laura was mentioning, carry out projects on assisted migration, or assisted evolution, genetically modified species. You can do lots of things. So I think it was very important to study bioethics. But one of the things that Aldo Leopold, in one of his famous books on bioethics, was proposing was that there are moral reasons to protect and restore the environment. Now we know that there's various reasons for ecological restoration. So you can focus on restoring the natural capital because you rely on the services of that environment, or helping human communities to adapt to changing conditions, mitigating climate change, helping threatened or endangered species, for aesthetic reasons as well, because you want to have a forest nearby. Moral reasons, to regulate harvest or use of services, cultural relevance of native environments, for instance, for native populations, or just to maintain a healthy landscape, for instance. So there's lots of different reasons for carrying out ecological restoration. And I would like to know, what are your targets, your goals of your different projects? And maybe start with you, Eric.
Yeah, well, I could speak to that because I think this is actually something I differ a little bit with Laura and maybe some of you in the room about this idea of historical baselines, which is to say the reason we study the history of the environment in the past isn't to like say that this time was better than that time was better than that time. It's actually to understand how you got to each one of those times. It's a thicker reading of history, not a thin reading of history. You know, for example, we study World War II historians might study the Battle of the Bulge. They don't want to actually refight the Battle of the Bulge. That's not the goal. That's not the point. But sometimes when you see historical ecology spoken of in the restoration context, that's the way it's literally meant. Like, oh, it was that, therefore it has to be that again. But that isn't actually the point of historical ecology. The point of historical ecology is to understand what was here. And then it's a scholarship and it's a scientific kind of endeavor, if you like. It's sort of the bridging of, humanities and science. But those are also ways of knowing. They aren't value systems, right? At least the way I think of science. Science is a way of knowing things about the world, but it doesn't imply anything about the values you bring. You have to bring the values from some other space. And sometimes, you learn something new through science that changes your values, and that's fine. So what are the values I would bring, say, to advise an urban conservation program in New York City? Well, I would say that we should, work together to have a place for all the species that were here in the past that were supplanted by the city, that were moved out because of the development of the city over the last 400 years. And there may be some of those that can't be here anymore because of climate change, right? And if they can't be here, then the city has some obligation to give a place for those species everywhere. And this is, there might be some species that were here that are dangerous, like timber rattlesnake was actually described from a type specimen collected in New York City by, that was sent to Linnaeus. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Seton Falls Park has a creek running through it. It's called Rattlesnake Creek, because there used to be timber rattlesnake over there. I'm not suggesting we bring timber rattlesnake back to the Bronx, but I am suggesting that there should be a place in this world where timber rattlesnake can live, right? That's maybe a protected place, right? Where you're not allowed to hunt them and they can do their things. And so I think there's a sort of species way of thinking about that, and then there's a community way of thinking about that. So, Sarah's organization, which I'm on the board of, by the way, works to conserve forests and wetlands. But there's many different kinds of forests that we should be trying to conserve, and many different kinds of wetlands that do different functions and have different habitat roles for different species. And the only way I can figure out to even have a thing to say about what those might be is by referencing the past and then thinking about the future.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to?
Nice tee up, thank you. I think, we think about kind of the three legs of a stool being trying to preserve and support as much biodiversity and kind of ecosystem health as possible. And as an example, we've identified 68 unique forest types within New York City. How many of those can we retain to exist 100 years from now, thinking about the over 2,000 species that call our forests home? Like, how many of those can we kind of retain? So thinking about it from that more like preserving nature for its own sake, really leaning into the benefits, social and ecological benefits that it provides, just another kind of recent finding from research, but we recently learned that the interior, and actually Seton Falls Park is where this stat comes from, the interior of Seton Falls Park on the hottest day in the summer of 2022 was 15 degrees cooler than the sidewalk under a tree at the edge of that park. So thinking, how can we lean into the cooling and the carbon capture and the stormwater capture and the things that our city needs, honestly, just to remain livable and functioning? How can we harness what nature has to offer related to those things? And then how do we really lean into their value for people? Places to recreate, but also we run a workforce development program. How do we make sure that the people who are paid to take care of these places are paid, living wages, and that we're training and hiring local people to do this work. So we're really leaning into the people of our communities and making sure that they are both benefiting economically and also benefiting socially, and I would even say sort of spiritually and mentally, and in all of the many sort of facets of their human personhood from the existence of these places. And it's a lot to carry all of those things at once. So we do set ecological targets, but we also set targets for things like visitation and workforce, and we try to layer those together as simply as we can, but with the goal of really kind of keeping all of those threads in mind when we plan the projects that we do.
That's an interesting approach, yeah. Todd?
So when we started this process about 20 years ago, we knew the history of the forest. We knew it had been called the Hemlock Grove. There are wonderful pictures from the late 19th and early 20th century of these towering hemlocks. It looked like a 2/3 scale model of the coast redwood forest of California. There were Hudson River School painters who painted the Bronx River and its valley. We had a very clear picture. Again, we had the inventory of what was here. We also had no staff. We had no money. We just had an idea. But what we also had is the greatest collection of gardeners on the planet, and a wonderful 125-year history of growing plants effectively from around the world. So what we came up with to guide the early days of our management plan was we wanted to promote the natural regeneration of native species, whatever those species might be. We knew about the litany of disturbances. We knew all the barriers to success. We knew that hemlock was mostly gone. We knew that chestnut was gone. We knew all of what was gone, but we also saw what was there. And we wanted to give, and we want to give, what is here, what is capable of dealing with these conditions, the space to continue to thrive. But the beautiful thing about adaptive management is that we don't think that that's necessarily right or wrong. We think it's expedient and defensible. And so over time, as we learn more, then we might change that goal in order to achieve some other objective. And then to Sarah's point about people, our forest is a little bit funny because we intentionally exclude people because they really have been one of the big drivers of disturbance from the interior of the forest. But we invite people to the trails through the forest. And always imagining the balance between the people who are experiencing and appreciating the forest and the health and the dynamism of the forest itself, that's what our goal is.
By the way, if you haven't been in the Family Thane Forest, please do. It's absolutely fantastic. You don't really think that you are in the middle of the Bronx of New York. Daniel?
I'm going right after this. Yeah, I mean, American Prairie's goal is to restore a fully functioning prairie ecosystem, with all of its component parts, and manage that as a public access project as well. We rarely, if ever, really put a point on it, but I mean, I think the ethical or the underpinnings is just we have chosen to do so because we feel that it is right to do so. I think Eric put it actually really well. I don't know if I can improve on that too much, but I was just having this conversation with a friend last night. This idea that science can tell you how to do a thing is not really a very good tool or even a sufficient tool to tell you whether or if you should do a thing. And I think for a long time we've since Aldo Leopold penned this idea of a land ethic, I feel like we're all very reluctant to talk about the idea that it's like we just make these decisions to do restoration because we feel that this is appropriate in an ethical context or something like that. I get asked all the time, I won't name names, but people are like, give me, the scientific rationale for like doing the rewilding work that you're doing. And I'm like, there's a benefit, right? I can tell you the story about how prairies are really good at sequestering carbon even when they burn because all the carbon's captured underground. I can tell you how bison restore, wildlife just by being there, and so prairie dogs do the same thing. And all these ecosystem services and things we can quantify, but at the end of the day, you're just doing it because we have made a decision that the land has a right to exist, the land, in the way that Leopold thought about it, has a right to exist, and therefore we can recreate it, and in some sense we should, and be mindful of the ways that we're doing that. But I think at some point, it's worth acknowledging, and it's okay to say just like, we've just decided that that is something that's worth doing, because these things have a right to exist in and of themselves.
Great, thank you. So we are in the Climate Week. As we meet here, there's thousands of people thinking about climate and discussing and making important decisions. We know as a fact that the temperature of the planet has increased over 1 Celsius degrees since industrial times, pre-industrial times. And we also know that that's been caused by humans. And scenarios of future climate predict that by 2100, the temperature in the planet might exceed 4 Celsius degrees. That means that a baby right now, like a just born baby, will be 70 or 80-year-old by that time, and will see the planet completely different. So this is the scenario this is the world we are living in now. And I would like to ask the panelists, what's your opinion about the impact of climate change in the respective environments? So whoever wants to start.
Well, I can say what I think it means for our work in New York City. Climate change is going to be a huge stress on the city. There's a lot of the city where we built in the past in places that are, that used to flood, or wetland and streams and beaches, and those places are going to flood again because of sea level rise and because of coastal storms and intense rainfall events like Hurricane Ida, and that's going to be, that's a hard thing. That's a hard truth. And some of the work I'm doing, it's about 20% of the city's land area. About 1.2 million people are living in flood zones that are going to be dangerous for them in the future, if they're not dangerous for them already today. But I also think that this crisis is the opportunity that the city needs to transform into the next best version of itself. And in doing so, we need to build more housing. We need to have a better transportation system than the one we all experienced getting here today. And we need to be able to restore nature. We need to be able to restore those wetlands and those streams and those beaches again. And that's why we need, ecological restoration. That's why we need restoration research to know what we're doing. We need to have, to learn from the experiences of what's going on. We need to be monitoring, and we need to have the people to maintain those areas going forward. And that's going to be a huge opportunity to rebuild, not just make the city more climate resilient, but to redress the biodiversity loss and the environmental justice issues, because of course many of these people that are living in the lowest lying areas are also the most vulnerable parts of society. So it's a crisis, but it's also a huge opportunity to remake our city for the next generation. And I really hope that we grasp it. And I will say that even if we don't grasp it, the climate change is still coming and will force the issue of it. So it's just really a matter of how much pain we want to take in doing the right thing.
Todd or Sarah or Daniel, whoever wants to continue.
I'm just going to go.
I'm not a climate scientist, and I know that I've seen projections for the prairie region about what that means. It's probably easy to guess. It's going to get hotter and drier, probably. I think the best thing we can do, it feels difficult to try and make prescriptions about how to address that before it's there. The prairie is this place that exists on really big, like, place scales, right? Some of, like, the charismatic species that call that place home. Again, bear with me, I'm a animal person here, but, like, you know, the bison and prairie dogs have an enormous range of tolerance for, like, heat and drought already because of the way grasslands work. They're probably okay. Maybe we see range shifts in certain migratory birds. We're a place-based organization. We can't do much about that. But I think, again, going back to this idea that with the first step, the kind of obvious step, is if you can refill that biodiversity, refill that bioabundance, restart some of those ecological processes and that cycling, that at least gives the place the best chance it has to be resilient and to adapt. Beyond that, we'll have to see.
So maybe about 15 years ago or so, we did a program called Gardening in a Changing Climate here, and we did it for several years. People were asking the same questions, not necessarily about natural ecosystems, but about their gardens. And sort of my first feeling when asked to participate was that, well, you know, gardeners are inherently already aggrieved by the weather. We just feel like the weather has us in its sights. So welcome to our world, you know, the rest of you. And of course, you know, I kid. To Eric's point, there's so much we can do to make it less horrific than it's trending to be. So let's all be very honest. And every one of us individually and all of us collectively should do those things. There's no question. But it's also quite clear that the feedback loop is such that there will be continued impacts of climate change for generations, no matter what we do. So taking that second scenario and then looking at biodiversity specifically, I think the most important thing we can do is to maximize biodiversity, because within that biodiversity is the capacity to deal with the change that is coming.
Thank you, Todd and Sarah.
I don't have a ton to add, but I will just say I do think there is this. At its best, I think we've seen a huge breaking down of silos and the idea of nature as a part of the solution across every sector, and I find that incredibly encouraging. The only other thing I'll say, and this is something I try to personally keep in mind, is enjoying nature today and finding sort of joy in spending time in the natural world is a great way to reframe our anxiety about climate change and to bring, I would say, both hope and kind of renewed energy to thinking creatively about solving these problems. And while I believe, you know, all day, every day in my professional life that tackling climate change is, you know, it's the challenge of our time, I also think it's incredibly important to remember why we're doing it, which is the love of the places and the love of the people and the landscapes that we're trying to protect and evolve.
Thank you. So let's talk about ecological restoration and people. So the first actions of ecological restoration I carried out were with just students of biology. But I soon discovered that if I didn't have the contribution from the local communities, it was not successful. And also I discovered quite interestingly that many communities actually don't accept the idea of you planting trees. When I was planting the trees in Bogota at night, they were taking them out because trees were seen as threats for them. Because a forest in many areas with high crime rate can be seen as a place where you are in danger. So they didn't want to have trees unless there was an education program around to teach them why it was important to have trees. So I quickly learned that without the local communities, you don't have success many times. And in my latest actions, we even involved victims of the massacres in Colombia. They were planting the trees, honoring those who passed away. So that can be actually become a symbolic act of reconciliation as well. So talking about the importance of involving people in our activities, and I would like to start with perhaps Dania, because you have a fascinating group of stakeholders. You have to deal with farmers, with indigenous communities, with ranchers? How do you go about it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So where we work in central Montana is kind of around this existing really, really big wildlife refuge. But the region has been home to indigenous peoples, basically as long as there's been indigenous peoples in the Americas, probably at least 20,000 years, we don't know. I mean, it seems like the date keeps getting pushed back, but like in a modern context, it's the Ani and Dakota and the Blackfeet. I mean, it was a kind of there's a lot of wildlife there, and you're talking about people with nomadic lifeways that are following bison around, basically. So it uses this kind of communal hunting ground. That's the kind of long human history that's going back again somewhere between, let's safely 12,000 years ago. And then the modern history is you've got now getting to the point of about 5 generations of ranchers as well, like modern kind of what we think of as kind of like open range, not open range, but big pasture ranching. Has been going on, some of that by the descendants of the native peoples that lived and still do live there, and some of them from the descendants of Europeans that settled the region 150 years ago. And so you're in this context where this does have this like deep human history, right? In multiple contexts, it's kind of indigenous and non-indigenous human history. And so American Prairie the short version of what we do is when ranches come up for sale, it's like all ranch land in that country, we buy them and we convert them from being places where we can make commodities, create beef products, to places where we can manage biodiversity. So it's all willing seller, willing buyer. We don't have the ability or the desire to buy land that's not for sale, yada, yada. But that, nevertheless, we are controversial because we are seen as kind of threatening to the status quo of what's out there, right? I mean, this is the problem that we face. And I don't like to put words in our detractors' mouths, but I do think it's fair to say that if you really get to the heart of the issue, often what that is that we are just different. We're managing the land in something that it does not approximate what it's been for 100 or 150 years, or in fairness, even before that in many cases, although we don't really know as much when we go back further in history. And so I think one of the criticisms that I think I can empathize with, although I think it is inaccurate, is that, American Prairie by its existence is turning back the clock to like Lewis and Clark days, or what they saw, or some vision of pre-colonial prairie North America, and that by virtue of that kind of wilderness, which we are not, but that like all these towns will disappear, right? People's like access to their like local, I mean, we're talking about towns of 1,600 people or fewer in the region, right? The ambulance is driven by a volunteer. The firefighters are just like people that live in the community. The municipal water source is like struggling, like they can't build hotels because they can't, like one more toilet will like blow up the sewer system, right? And so they see our existence as wanting to like remove those towns from the map. And I think we've really had to do a lot of work more recently to dispel, we hear crazy rumors and myths, but these are the kind of like what I feel are legitimate concerns, again, misguided, but there's an effort to kind of show people like, no, like American Prairie is also a public access project, right? Like people are gonna need a place to buy groceries, get gas. I live out there with my family and my 21-month-old daughter, right? Like it is important to me to have a hospital, even if, I mean, it's already 50 miles away on a dirt road. If that's not there, it becomes a very, very long trek, right? So there's this kind of like dispelling this idea that like we're trying to create wilderness, and this idea of like, well, how do we honor cultural and traditional uses of the land while we rebuild this thing, which we've always said was a vision of kind of like people in nature. Prairies have always been human landscapes since time immemorial. So how do you honor that and kind of dispel this idea that like what we're trying to do is create a wilderness that's a peopleless place, because it's just inaccurate. But an understandable concern.
Yeah, well, I feel that we could talk forever about these topics, and perhaps like hours and hours and hours, but we have only 3 minutes left. So I would like to ask one final question to all of you in these 3 minutes. But it's related to people as well, and is how can anybody contribute to ensure that the promise of ecological restoration is achieved, and that this really becomes the decade of ecosystem restoration? Eric, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I actually think that the most important thing you can do is to essentially take care of your family and to give them an experience of nature early on in life, kind of like Sarah was talking about. I think this really starts with ourselves and our families and then builds out. If you're lucky enough to have a garden or have some piece of land, then planting native species is good. And if it's big enough, you can plant native trees like oak trees and hickories. If you live in the New York City region, that's the kind of thing you should go for. because those are the species that are most important. And then, if you're willing to go one more step, then talk to your neighbors about what they're doing, because perhaps their land, their backyard next to your backyard can make a bigger and bigger patch. And one of the things science is very clear is that the bigger the patch is, the more kind of functions and diamonisms you'll get for other species. So.
Thank you. Sarah?
I'm going to say yes, and I think that this is a deeply political issue. So the one thing that I am going to say is I think it's really important to connect the dots between the budgetary and legislative priorities at all levels of government and the kind of vision that we are aspiring to. And I'll just share some good news, which is that last week, New York City Council amended the public charter to officially set a goal of achieving 30% canopy in the 5 boroughs. We're currently at 22%. This is in a period of, as folks who have looked at the paper, incredible strain on the city's budget. But that type of vision and setting a long-term goal that becomes part of our law it's a real act of leadership, and I think really sort of drives us forward.
Mine's simple. Garden as if life depends on it.
Become a gardener. Daniel?
In addition to that, I would say, I think one thing that people don't really understand, and this is particularly true out west, but I don't think it's wrong out east either, is that increasingly state wildlife agencies, and most of our wildlife is managed at the state level unless it's endangered, they work for us. We don't vote on how much wildlife there is, but increasingly wildlife officials, when pressed, will say, no, we don't manage for biological conditions, we manage based on social tolerance. We will ultimately have as much wildlife in this world, whether it's, dare I say, timber rattlesnakes around the corner or grizzly bears in central Montana, as people are willing to accept and demand. I don't think people realize, by and large, that all of you sitting in this room, all of us, we live in some biologist district. You can call that person and say, hey, I would prefer to live in a slightly wilder world, whatever that means to you. And your voice doesn't carry a lot of weight, but you and all your friends and your neighbors does. Out west, the only people that go to these meetings are hunters, by and large. And that's fine. That's a legitimate use group in Montana. But there are birders that have a right to go and show up and just say, I would really like to live in a world that had more long-billed curlews. You are a public servant, and you are in charge of this. Can you make that happen? I don't know why more people aren't talking about this. You get as much wildlife as you ask for, basically. That's my plug. Yeah.
So I think with these recommendations and visions, we conclude this panel. I hope you found it engaging and inspiring. And thank you very much to all. And thank you, please, an applause to the panelists.
Yeah. What a terrific conversation. Thank you all so much. Thank you for that. And I hope all of you are leaving with a little bit more knowledge and a little bit more hope. And please join us and purchase your books if you're interested in learning more, and enjoy our beautiful 250 acres on this wonderful day. Thank you for being here.